My brother and his fiancée asked if I would house sit for them over the weekend, while they visited his soon-to-be in-laws. Like any good sibling would, I agreed, and adjusted my schedule accordingly. That is, I did nothing at all, since my plans, which involved video games and movies, could still be carried out just as easily from within his home. There were no rules to follow, no plants or animals to look after, no appliances or furnaces or machinery to watch and service. It was an ordinary suburban home, and I had obviously known the man my entire life. I was fully aware of his habits and preferences, or so I thought. Unbeknownst to me, my brother harbored a truly horrifying secret, a secret I uncovered by mere chance while tidying up the house. Due to certain circumstances which I won't waste time getting into, I work from home, although lately my employment hasn't really demanded much of me, so I typically try to find things to occupy my time until nighttime arrives. When I feel personally justified in playing games, watching movies and shows, and generally not doing anything very productive. Since I had arrived at around 2 p.m., I had several hours to fill with some sort of task or job, so I chose to clean up my brother's house, something that I knew he wouldn't object to, and he might even thank me for. His fiancée, despite being a very kind and personable woman, is also lazy when it comes to cleanliness, and together they're a slovenly force not to be reckoned with, unless you're absolutely determined, like I was. I swept through the house, figuratively and literally, with a veritable armament of cleaning supplies and utensils, polishing, wiping, straightening, dusting, and destaining, transforming each room into something you would actually want to step into. I scoured every inch, uncovered every crumb, and even took care of the kitchen garbage, which had bafflingly accumulated well above the can's rim, rising to a pyramidal prominence higher than even the nearby countertops. I had, of course, been in the house before, but during my sanitation of it, I developed a familiarity with it, a grimy intimacy that I was sure surpassed even my brother's knowledge. When the task was done, I sat down on the couch and sighed with relief at the clock on the mantel above the fireplace, which showed that nearly 3 hours had passed. I figured that by that time I showered and gathered some snacks. I could comfortably indulge myself in entertainment without any self-inflicted psychological backlash. My brother's couch is very comfortable, with cushions that gradually envelop your butt regardless of weight, so that it feels as if you're blissfully sinking into some ultimate state of comfiness. You would just have to try to understand it. Had these not been so comfortable, I might not have noticed the thing, might have had a pleasant weekend playing video games and watching anime, without any sort of horrifically traumatizing experience. But that couch was dang comfy, and I sank into it, until my inclination brought my gaze toward the top of the wall immediately before me, specifically an air vent in the wall where I saw an object. My curiosity was piqued, and I also made a mental note to locate and clean the other grates after I had investigated and cleaned this one. I brought a chair from the kitchen, positioned it directly beneath the grate, mounted it with all the anxiety and self-induced wobbliness of a person with a terrible fear of heights, and unlatched the small metal cover. I reached inside and retrieved the object, which turned out to be a small piece of paper, thinned and yellowed by countless cycles of air circulation. Not forgetting that I was standing about above the height of 3 or 4 feet, I disembarked from the chair and returned to the comfort of the couch, and then unfolded the piece of paper. Any other person would have probably thought the message was a joke, something left by my brother prior to his departure, with the mischievous expectation of being found by his ever-curious house-sitter. But I know my brother, and I knew then that the handwriting on this paper was his, but from years ago, well before his penmanship had improved. as required by a position he had gotten where writing was still a habitual element of one's workday. The message was scrawled sloppily, unevenly, hideously, in my brother's trademark handwriting, which, during our childhood, had begat several suspicions, all untrue, that he was a bit, well, slow. My brother is and has always been very intelligent, but his handwriting is abhorrent, fixed only by the aforementioned necessity. Furthermore, as someone who has read their fair share of old and withered books, I have a good eye for old paper, and I knew at once that the piece I held had not been artificially aged. The paper must have been in the vent for at least a few years, clinically subjected to a harrowing time of central heating. It had been written by my brother a very long while ago, and placed within the vent with the expectation of being inevitably found by someone, but not me. The message said, "It's not in here. If this is the last place you've looked, you'll never find it. Just give up and go home. It's mine and you'll never get it back." Seeing as how my brother's fiancée has a demonstrable aversion to cleaning, I knew that they were not the message's anticipated recipient either. That left some entirely unknown friend or associate, someone I had evidently not been introduced to, since my brother had not introduced me to any of his friends. He and his fiancée were very reclusive people, for reasons that were both understandable and relatable, and I never questioned his restrictive social life. I had no leads, and yet the message was oddly alluring, almost like a challenge, and carried a suggestion of actual mystery, something beyond a long-forgotten prank. There was something in the house, and I had once endeavored to find it, forsaking my planned night of yummy snacks and flashing pixels. For the second time that day, I swept through the house, probing, uncovering, and peeling away all surfaces and objects that might have hidden some unknown secret, whilst totally ignorant to what the secret could be. When another hour passed and I hadn't found anything out of the ordinary, I decided to check places where only my brother would think to hide something. Places like inside cereal boxes, DVD cases, the little compartments in the bottom of his GameCube, inside old shoes, etc. After another half hour, these two proved to be dead ends, and I might have given up the whole search if I hadn't inadvertently given myself a new investigative lead. Since the note was clearly old, written during a time when the house might have been at the height of its disorder, I retraced my steps back to the places that had taken the most time to clean. The first, the oven, once encrusted with heat-blackened and wholly unidentifiable substances. The second, the hall closet outside their bedroom, across from the guest bathroom, which had been rendered nearly inaccessible by a mountain of discarded laundry, presumably the unwashed towels and clothing of guests, although what guests I couldn't begin to imagine. I had never slept over at the house before. I checked the oven again, inspecting both the floor and the roof of the space, but found nothing. The hall closet, which I had emptied of its foul-smelling laundry and gas-bombed with disinfectant, seemed ordinary at first. It was undecorated and unpainted, bearing a few shelves and a vacuum that I knew my brother had entirely forgotten about. Being very exhausted by my thorough cleaning and even more thorough searching, I absent-mindedly rested on the vacuum, and a very strange thing happened. A bell sounded from somewhere below, and the vacuum sank into a depression in the carpeted floor. At the same time, the house let out a short yet loud groan, as if the entire structure had shifted in response to this lever-like action. I quickly relieved the vacuum of my weight and stepped out of the closet, but the action had apparently finished, because the house resumed its previous quietness, and the vacuum sprang back up from the depression in the floor, which seamlessly sealed itself. But clearly something had happened, some event which had altered the structure of the house in a considerable way. Cautiously, I crept back downstairs and into the living room. my eyes scanning for any major or subtle change in the architecture. When I found nothing, I sat on the couch, even more puzzled than I had been only a few minutes earlier. And then for the second time, I noticed something behind the grate of the vent above me. Forgetting for the moment my fear of heights, I brought the chair back into the living room, positioned it beneath the vent, and I climbed up. I slid aside the grate, retrieved the paper, and opened it right there, not even bothering to climb down first. I probably should have, since the shock of this newly and oddly arrived message made me fall off the chair and land roughly on my hip. The message read, "Well, it looks like you found it. Now all you have to do is make sure that it doesn't find you." The fall, despite having been only a few feet, it had knocked the wind out of me, and it took me a second to gather my thoughts and figure out my next course of action. And in that short moment, something else happened. Something else moved. And the strange, unsettling part about it was that I couldn't tell from where I had heard the movement. It was as if the sound had originated from several points at once, but not from different sources, merely different auditory echoes of the same source. It was like a thunderous clap that resounded through the house, leaving me somewhat disoriented. I scrambled up onto the couch, pulling even my feet onto its cushiony surface, like a child might keep its feet from dangling over a bed, for fear of their toes being bitten off by monsters. Thankfully, I had had my phone with me, and I hadn't left it on a charger in some other part of the house, which my unnerved mind immediately categorized as unsafe territory. I called my brother, while my eyes flicked back and forth between the two entrances to the living room, one to the left from the kitchen, and one to the right from the foyer, which also led to the stairs. My brother picked up on the third ring, and before he could launch into his anticipated, "Hey, what's up, how's the house?" questionnaire, I demanded an explanation for the notes, the strange vacuum lever, and the unsettling sounds of the house. My brother's response didn't assuage my nerves or ease my growing unrest. It only made me feel 10 times worse, and actually inspired terror. He said, "Listen, be completely still wherever you are. Do not move, do not speak. I will be home in 1 hour. I need you to survive for just 1 hour." He then ended the call, leaving me with that grim and terrifying mission. Carefully, silently, I placed the phone beside me and pulled my legs to my chest. I might have looked childish, but I didn't care. I had been vaguely warned about some ominous threat within the house, a threat that was apparently powerful or sinister enough to endanger my life. I watched those two aforementioned entrances and tried to imagine what kind of domestic demon could emerge from them. My mind was blank, however, and I wasn't able to conjure up any image or idea. And this deficiency of imagination, this nightmarish ignorance, caused my terror to worsen. I'm not a stupid person, but it's arguable that people do make rash or possibly even foolish decisions when under duress. And the terrible uncertainty of my predicament drove me to make just one such decision. I grabbed my phone to check the time. I hadn't made a mental note of what time it had been when my brother had ended the call, so I wanted to at least establish a general point from which I would have to survive. But this was undeniably a moment of movement, something my brother had gravely advised against. Rightfully so, I soon found out. That thunderous sound returned, only this time it was clear from where it had emanated. The noise had obviously come from above me, directly above me, somewhere on or perhaps even within the ceiling. I froze, my hand raised midair, my phone screen turned slightly towards me. The sound occurred again, louder this time, which I feared meant that it, whatever it was, had come closer. I didn't dare to even raise my eyes towards the sound, didn't dare make any movements beyond the softest breaths I could imagine. The sound rang out once more, and this time the house shook as if in response to the fury of some great invisible beast. Pictures fell from the walls, stacks of books toppled over, and I heard a glass or two fall and shatter in the kitchen. But still, I remained still, even though my movements could have been interpreted as one of many inanimate responses to these sounds' ultrasonic power. The house settled a few moments later, but I still felt the presence of the unknown entity or force lurking above me, scanning the room for an occupant, just as I had scanned for an intruder. I assumed then that it was blind, or otherwise incapable of detecting me unless I moved. My arm had begun to hurt, the strain of its awkwardly raised position and the minor weight of my phone combining to produce a pain that gradually mounted, causing me to panic even more. Just when I had thought I would let my arm collapse and subsequently be noticed by the thing above me, I heard another sound, as loud as the others but differently intoned, one that sounded almost like an inverse reverberation of the original sound, a sonic counterpoint of that original unsettling clamor. In response to this, I heard a few more sounds from above, although these, strangely, I interpreted as whimpering, the feeble mewling of a frightened infant. There was another structural tremor, as if something large had scrambled across the ceiling, and then the front door burst open. It was my brother, bearing a large and strangely constructed brass instrument with several knobs and curved pipes. Still unsure of whether or not movement was permitted, I remained frozen in place, but the awkward and increasingly uncomfortable position was mercifully relieved when my brother ran over and scooped me up in his arms. He hugged me tightly and muttered an apology that I barely comprehended, my mind still shaken by the bizarre series of events. He set me down, and after returning the instrument to a case he had strapped to his back, he told me about the echoic entity. For the sake of my brother's privacy, I won't divulge all the information pertaining to this phenomenon, but I will share this. My brother and his fiancée had at some point tried to have a child, but unfortunate circumstances prevented this from happening. This was the primary reason for their shared reclusiveness, a desire to avoid other people who might have children, and to ask when my brother and his fiancée would have theirs. A few months after this tragic event, during a moment when the memory of it had returned for whatever reason with horrible potency, something entered the house. Something that seemed to have been drawn there by the inexpressible grief that emanated, like an aura, from those two once aspiring parents. This thing, for whatever reason, situated itself within the home, and would occasionally make sounds not dissimilar to those of a child, albeit much louder, and occasionally destructive. Rather than call a medium or an exorcist or someone allegedly equipped to handle such supernatural phenomena, my brother, at the impassioned behest of his fiancée, personally investigated the invisible visitor, charted its movements, and studied its behavior, solely the sounds that it produced and the effects it had upon its surroundings. Then, after somewhat establishing general rule for its actions, he modified his home to accommodate the entity, which he said exists in only a semi-corporeal state. In essence, my brother had turned his entire house into a nursery for this strange being that had imprinted on him and his fiancée. He had not told me about any of this before, mostly because he wasn't sure if it were actually real, or if he and his wife were suffering from some sort of shared hallucination induced by their abysmal grief. He said that the entity routinely entered periods of rest, and he had planned his vacation in accordance with one such period, so he hadn't feared that I would be in any danger while house-sitting. He obviously hadn't expected me to go on a cleaning spree and uncover the vacuum lever, which essentially opened up the entity's crib. When I asked what would have happened if the entity had discovered me, he said he honestly didn't know, but knew that the entity would probably not respond well to the absence of its parents and the appearance of an unknown stranger. The horn, he said, was another invention of his, a device that produced a sort of lullaby for the entity. The notes, Those cryptic and goaty messages that had started the nightmare for me were meant for the entity's original owner or parent. According to my brother, his fiancée had insisted that he write them because she believed that the entity had escaped from its home after being cruelly mistreated there. She had no basis for this belief, but nonetheless believed it wholeheartedly. Had I not been moments away from potential death, I might have doubted his whole story, might have attributed these strange sounds to some sort of structural issue, or maybe even powerful speakers hidden within the walls. But the fear I had felt, the supreme terror that had filtered through my bloodstream to petrify me on that couch, was assurance enough that the entity was in fact real, and that my brother had indeed saved me from certain doom. I thanked him for saving me, and he thanked me for cleaning the house, even though it had been somewhat dirtied again by the entity's sonic violence. He assured me that the entity would rest for quite a while, and said that he had to return to his in-laws, who believed he had simply forgotten something here at the house. He left, leaving me alone with the slumbering, echoic entity, his questionably acquired child from some outer realm, and yet another round of cleaning to do.